The air in Jerusalem hung heavy, not with the usual scent of incense and baking bread, but with something foul and alien. It was a smell that turned stomachs and twisted hearts, the stench of swine. Antiochus Epiphanes, therefore, a king who called himself God manifest, had decided that the Jewish way of life was simply inconvenient. He wanted everyone to be Greek, to think Greek, to worship Greek gods. And he wasn't asking nicely. His soldiers, big men with loud voices and even louder intentions, marched into the sacred temple, the very place where generations had offered prayers, where the holiest rituals were performed, was now their playground. They didn't just walk in, they stomped, laughed, and brought with them the ultimate insult. On the revered altar, where only pure offerings were allowed, they sacrificed a pig. The blood, the fat, the very presence of the unclean animal was a direct punch to the gut of every Jew. It wasn't just a desecration, it was a scream of contempt, an intimate, deliberate act of spiritual violence designed to break their spirit. You'd expect chaos, right? Screaming, fighting, desperate rebellion. But for a moment, there was something else. A shocking, calculated stillness. People watched, their faces a mix of horror and something deeper, something simmering just beneath the surface. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, the silence of a coiled spring. They saw their faith, their very identity, being ground underfoot, yet they held their breath. This wasn't weakness, it was a terrifying strength, a silent promise that this wouldn't stand. Then a flicker. A man, old and weathered, stood before the soldiers, his eyes burning. He was a zealot, a man whose life was his faith. When commanded to offer a sacrifice to a Greek idol, he refused, not with shouts, but with a quiet, firm shake of his head. The soldiers moved to force him, but before they could, another figure, younger and bolder, stepped forward. He pulled a hidden knife, a quick flash of steel, and the soldier fell. It was a small act, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of an empire, but it was a spark. It was a declaration that some things were more important than life itself. Tradition, faith, identity, these weren't just words. They were the very bones of their existence. They were resilient, like ancient stones, worn smooth by time but never broken. This act, small as it was, whispered a powerful truth. You can try to break us, but you can't erase who we are. The air shifted again. The stench of swine still hung heavy, but now, mixed with it, was the faint scent of fear. Not just from the oppressed, but from the oppressors too. Distant murmurs started, growing from hushed whispers to a low hum, like bees disturbed from their hive. And in the shadows, where people had once hidden their tears, now glinted something else. The cold, hard steel of hidden weapons. The silence was over. The fight was about to begin. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. To truly understand the depth of that defiance, we need to step back, way back, to a time before the pig on the altar, before the decrees, before Antiochus even became a name that inspired dread. Imagine ancient Judea, not as a battlefield, but as a land humming with life and deep-rooted traditions. It was a place where the rhythm of existence was tied to the sun, the seasons, and the sacred calendar. Families were everything, huge networks of cousins, aunts, and uncles, all living close, sharing meals, and telling stories passed down for generations. The routines were simple but meaningful. Mornings began with prayers, the smell of baking bread filling the air, children playing in dusty courtyards. Evenings brought families together for shared meals, the glow of oil lamps casting long shadows as elders taught the younger ones the stories of their people, the laws, the history. Every aspect of life, from farming the land to raising children, was connected to their faith. It wasn't just a religion, it was their entire way of life, their identity, woven into the very fabric of their days. At the heart of all this, both physically and spiritually, was the temple in Jerusalem. It wasn't just a building, it was the pulse of their world. For them, it was where heaven met earth, where God's presence was most tangible. Pilgrimages were a common sight, people traveling from all corners of Judea, their hearts full of anticipation, to offer sacrifices, to pray, to feel that profound connection. The temple was a source of immense pride, a symbol of their unique covenant with God, and a constant reminder of who they were. But beneath this seemingly peaceful surface, there was a constant tension. Judea was rarely truly independent. They had seen empires come and go, one foreign ruler replacing another. This constant state of being under someone else's thumb meant they longed for peace, yes, but more than that, they yearned for self-determination. They wanted to live freely, to practice their faith without interference, to raise their children in their own traditions without fear. This longing made them vulnerable, open to promises of stability, even if those promises came with a foreign accent. Initially, when Hellenistic culture started to seep in, it wasn't seen as a threat, not directly anyway. It was more like a new fashion, a different way of thinking that some found interesting. Greek language, philosophy, even their gymnasiums started appearing in the bigger cities. Some Jewish people, especially those in positions of power, found themselves drawn to this new, sophisticated culture. It offered new opportunities, new ways to trade, new ways to climb the social ladder. It felt modern, progressive. Antiochus, in the beginning, wasn't the monster he became. He was a king who needed allies, and he presented himself as one. He made promises of protecting their religious freedom, of respecting their customs. He seemed like a reasonable ruler, someone who understood the importance of different cultures coexisting. But this was a slow game. The infiltration wasn't with armies and swords at first. It was with ideas, with subtle changes, with what seemed like benign cultural exchange. He laid the groundwork carefully, planting seeds of his influence, slowly exerting control. People didn't see the danger right away because it came wrapped in promises, in what looked like progress. They never imagined that this seemingly friendly cultural exchange would eventually lead to a pig on their sacred altar, a direct assault on the very soul of their nation. They were just trying to survive, to thrive, to keep their faith alive in a complicated world, and Antiochus knew exactly how to use that vulnerability. The promises Antiochus made, the ones that seemed so reassuring at first, started to unravel pretty quickly. It wasn't a sudden break, more like a slow, steady pulling apart of threads. People remembered him saying he'd respect their traditions, that their way of life was safe. But then, little by little, things changed. He'd issue a decree about taxes that felt heavier on Jewish communities, or he'd appoint officials who clearly favored Greek customs over theirs. Each time, it felt like a small crack, a tiny betrayal of that initial trust. They tried to make sense of it, to believe it was just a misunderstanding or a necessary evil of foreign rule. But the cracks kept coming, getting wider. He started pushing Greek gods more openly, not with a direct order to abandon their own god at first, but in more subtle ways. He'd fund temples to Zeus in nearby towns, making it clear which deities he preferred. He'd send Greek priests, men who didn't understand or care about Jewish laws, to oversee things. It was a veiled humiliation. It was like he was saying, "Your ways are old, ours are better." He'd manipulate things so that Jewish leaders who were more open to Hellenistic culture got more power, while those who stood firm in their faith found themselves sidelined, their influence chipped away. These weren't grand, dramatic confrontations every time. They were quiet slights, small erosions of dignity that added up. For example, there were times when Jewish laws, deeply important to their daily lives, were just ignored or openly mocked by Seleucid authorities. Like dietary laws, suddenly it became harder to get kosher meat, or soldiers would bring forbidden foods into Jewish homes during inspections, knowing it caused distress, or the Sabbath. It was supposed to be a day of rest, sacred time. But sometimes Seleucid officials would demand work on the Sabbath, or soldiers would march through towns, disrupting the peace. These acts, though seemingly minor to an outsider, were deeply offensive to a people whose lives were structured around these very rules. They felt their sacred space, even in their own homes, was being invaded. Then came the more direct injustices. The taxes, which always felt heavy, became truly crushing. It wasn't just about paying tribute, it felt like they were being bled dry to fund Antiochus's wars and his lavish Greek-style projects. Families struggled to put food on the table, and still, the tax collectors came, backed by armed soldiers. If you couldn't pay, your land could be taken, or worse, your children could be forced into servitude. It was a constant fear hanging over everyone. And the forced conscription of Jewish youth, young men who had been raised to study Torah and work the land, were suddenly taken to fight in Antiochus' armies, often against other peoples who had no quarrel with Judea. This wasn't just losing a son, it was losing a future, a generation. It was forcing them to participate in a system that was actively trying to erase their identity. They were made to fight for an empire that was systematically dismantling their own culture. These events, these constant pressures, these accumulating injustices, they weren't random. They were part of a pattern. The desecration of the temple, that shocking act of violence against their faith, wasn't just a sudden outburst. It was the culmination of years and years of this systemic oppression. It was the final straw after a long, slow campaign of disregard for their way of life. It showed them, beyond any doubt, that Antiochus wasn't just a king trying to rule. He was a king trying to destroy them, to wipe out their very essence. They had tolerated. They had tried to understand. They had hoped for better, but there comes a point when hope runs out and only defiance remains. The air in Judea became thick with dread. It was like a storm was coming, but instead of rain, it was fear that hung heavy, pressing down on everyone. Antiochus' decrees, once subtle, now came with a harshness that left no room for doubt. People walked with their heads down, their eyes always scanning for soldiers, for signs of trouble. The market, once a lively place for gossip and trade, grew quiet. Laughter was rare. The joy seemed to have been sucked right out of the land. Despair, a cold creeping thing, settled into homes and hearts. Families, once united by shared faith, began to fracture under the strain. There were loud, angry arguments at dinner tables. Some, weary of the constant harassment, argued for compromise. Maybe we should just go along, they'd say, just for a little while, until things blow over. It's for our safety. They'd point to neighbors who had already started adopting Greek names or attending the new pagan festivals, seemingly finding an easier path. Others, equally passionate, would rise up in fury, denouncing any talk of compromise as betrayal. How can you even suggest such a thing? They'd shout. This is our heritage, our God. We cannot give in. These arguments weren't just about religion. They were about survival, about identity, about what it meant to be a Jew in a world that wanted you to be something else. The pressure to conform wasn't just internal. It came from all sides. Seleucid officials, backed by soldiers, made it clear that adherence to Greek ways was the only acceptable path. Those who resisted faced severe penalties. Refused to eat pork, you could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. Caught observing the Sabbath, your family might lose their land. Circumcise your son. That was a death sentence for both mother and child. It was a brutal, systematic campaign to break their spirit. Antiochus wasn't just suggesting Hellenism anymore, he was forcing it down their throats. He issued edicts that explicitly forbade Jewish religious practices. No more Sabbath observance, no more dietary laws, no more studying the Torah. The worship of Greek gods, especially Zeus, became mandatory. Altars to pagan deities were set up in every town, and people were forced to offer sacrifices, often under the watchful eyes of soldiers. Imagine the weight of that. Being forced to betray everything you believed in, right in front of your children, for fear of losing your life. The shame, the guilt, the raw terror. People were caught in an impossible bind. If you complied, you felt like a traitor to your God, your ancestors, and your own soul. If you resisted, you faced unimaginable suffering, not just for yourself, but for your loved ones. Neighbors watched neighbors, wondering who would break, who would hold firm. There was a constant, unspoken judgment in every interaction. Children would ask their parents, "Why can't we be like them?" pointing to Hellenized families who seemed to live without fear. Parents struggled to explain, to instill faith while fearing for their children's lives. This was the emotional suffocation. Every breath felt heavy with fear and moral conflict. The air was thick with the scent of fear, the unspoken question of who would be next, who would be forced to make an impossible choice. It wasn't just physical oppression, it was a psychological war, designed to crush the will, to make people question the very foundations of their being. The temple's desecration was just one part of this larger, agonizing picture. It was the final, most public insult in a long line of humiliations. All of these pressures, all of these unbearable choices, were pushing the Jewish people to an absolute breaking point. Something had to give. The silence, the fear, the forced conformity. It couldn't last forever. The tension was too great, the oppression too complete. The silence, the fear, the forced conformity, it couldn't last forever. The tension was too great, the oppression too complete. Then came the devastating revelation, a truth that shattered any lingering hope for peaceful coexistence. Antiochus's ultimate plan wasn't just to make them conform, it was to completely wipe out Jewish faith and identity. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about eradication. He wanted to erase them, their history, their God, from the face of the earth. This wasn't just a threat to their religion, it was an existential threat to their very existence as a people. The slow burn of oppression suddenly became a raging fire. In the small town of Modian, an elderly priest named Mattathias watched this unfolding horror. He had seen enough. He had endured the humiliation, the broken promises, the increasing cruelty. But this final push to annihilate everything he held sacred was a line he would not cross. When a Seleucid official arrived in Modian, demanding that the villagers offer a pagan sacrifice to the Greek gods, Mattathias refused. He stood his ground, his voice steady despite his age, declaring that he and his family would remain faithful to their covenant. But then, a Hellenized Jew, eager to please the Seleucid authorities, stepped forward to perform the sacrifice. In that moment, something snapped inside Mattathias. He was not just defying an official, he was defending the very soul of his people. With a sudden, decisive move, Mattathias killed the Hellenized Jew on the altar, then turned and killed the Seleucid official as well. This was not a quiet protest, it was an explosion. It was the spark that ignited the rebellion. Mattathias, along with his 5 sons, fled into the Judean wilderness, calling on all those who were zealous for the Torah and loyal to the covenant to follow them. The act was audacious, dangerous, and absolutely necessary. It was a clear message, no more. They would not be erased. Antiochus's response was swift and brutal. His extreme behavior only solidified the resolve of those who chose to resist. He intensified the persecution, making examples of those who refused to abandon their faith. Stories spread like wildfire. Women who circumcised their sons were paraded through the city and then thrown from the city walls, with their babies still tied around their necks. Men who observed the Sabbath were burned alive in caves, choosing death over desecrating the holy day. An old man named Eleazar, nearly 90 years old, refused to eat pork, even when threatened with torture. He chose a noble death rather than defile himself, becoming a martyr who inspired countless others. A mother and her 7 sons were captured and tortured one by one, each refusing to eat forbidden meat, each proclaiming their faith before dying. Their unwavering courage, even in the face of unimaginable pain, became a rallying cry. These atrocities, meant to break their spirit, had the opposite effect. The harshness of the persecution, the sheer depravity of Antiochus's actions, created an unexpected opportunity. It stripped away all ambiguity. There was no more middle ground. You were either with Antiochus or you were against him. This clarity, born from extreme suffering, forged a unity among the scattered Jewish communities that had seemed impossible before. The quiet dissent, the hidden acts of defiance, now coalesced into an open, armed rebellion. People who had been afraid to speak now found their voice, driven by a desperate need for justice and survival. The cycle of suffering that had seemed endless was shattered by Mattathias's single defiant act. It fundamentally altered the direction of the narrative, moving it from passive endurance to active resistance. The fight for their faith, for their very identity, had begun. The immediate aftermath of Mattathias's defiance was a whirlwind of suffering and doubt. The Jewish people, spurred into open rebellion, faced a seemingly impossible struggle against the mighty Seleucid Empire. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in the stomach of every man, woman, and child. They had chosen to fight, but the cost was instant and heavy. Villages were raided, homes burned, and families scattered. The Seleucid forces, powerful and well-equipped, responded with overwhelming force, making it clear that any resistance would be met with brutal reprisal. Many wondered if Mattathias's audacious act had sealed their doom instead of securing their freedom. Could a small, untrained group of farmers and priests truly stand against a professional army? The question hung heavy in the air, breeding uncertainty and despair. Amidst this chaos and despair, Mattathias's sons rose to the challenge. Judah, especially, emerged as a natural leader. Known as Judah Maccabee, the Hammer, he possessed a fierce determination and a strategic mind that belied his humble origins. His brothers, Eleazar, Simon, John, and Jonathan, each played their part, forming the core of the Maccabean army. They rallied the people, speaking of faith, freedom, and the sacred covenant, reminding them of the prophets and the miracles of old. Some were quick to join, their hearts burning with righteous anger and a desperate hope for liberation. These were the staunch allies, ready to lay down their lives for their traditions. They saw the fight as a holy war, a necessary defense of their very existence. They believed that God would fight alongside them, just as he had in the days of Moses and Joshua. But not everyone shared this unwavering resolve. Many, understandably, feared the consequences. They had seen what Antiochus was capable of, and the thought of further persecution, of the complete annihilation of their families, was a powerful deterrent. These individuals, driven by a primal instinct for survival, sought to avoid conflict, some even choosing to cooperate with the Seleucids, offering information or resources in exchange for temporary safety. Others, already swayed by the allure of Hellenistic culture, saw the rebellion as a foolish endeavor, a suicidal act that would only bring more suffering. They had embraced Greek customs, found comfort in Greek philosophy, and saw the traditional ways as outdated and restrictive. These people, once neighbors and friends, now revealed themselves as adversaries, not out of malice, but from a different vision of the future, or simply a desperate desire to survive. The cultural dynamics of Judea played a significant role in how different groups responded. The rural communities, deeply rooted in their traditions and often isolated from the Hellenistic cities, were more inclined to support the rebellion. Their lives revolved around the synagogue and the Torah, and the desecration of the temple was a direct assault on their identity. In contrast, the urban centers, particularly Jerusalem, had a stronger Hellenistic influence. Many wealthy families and educated individuals had adopted Greek customs, language, and even religion. For them, the choice was not as clear-cut. They stood at a crossroads, torn between their heritage and the perceived advantages of assimilation. The psychological impact of the war was immense. Loss was everywhere. The constant threat of annihilation loomed over every family, every village. Children grew up knowing only conflict, their innocence replaced by a chilling familiarity with violence. The mental toll was heavy, marked by trauma, grief, and a gnawing uncertainty about the future. Yet, amidst this profound suffering, the seeds of a new resolve were sown, a determination to reclaim their heritage, no matter the cost. The Jewish people, against all odds, began the daunting task of rebuilding their lives and their spirit. The conflict raged on, but with each small victory, hope rekindled. The Maccabees, under Judah's brilliant leadership, achieved what many considered impossible. They were vastly outnumbered, facing the well-trained and heavily armed Seleucid forces, yet they continually outmaneuvered them. These were not conventional battles. They were guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and swift strikes, utilizing their intimate knowledge of the terrain and their unwavering belief in their cause. Each skirmish, each surprising defeat of a larger Seleucid contingent, became a story whispered from village to village, bolstering morale and confirming their conviction that divine favor was on their side. These military victories, against such overwhelming odds, weren't just strategic gains. They were profound spiritual affirmations, reinforcing the idea that their struggle was just and their God was powerful. They fought not just for land, but for the right to practice their faith, to be who they were. Meanwhile, far from Judea, the architect of their suffering, Antiochus IV, met his end. His demise was not glorious, not on a battlefield as he might have wished. Instead, he succumbed to a terrible illness, a slow and agonizing decline that many of the Jewish people saw as direct divine retribution. His final days were reportedly filled with torment and regret, his empire unraveling around him due to internal strife and external pressures. His death marked a significant turning point. The Seleucid Empire, once mighty, began to weaken, plagued by succession crises and rebellions. This political turmoil in the Seleucid court provided the much-needed breathing room for the Maccabees. It allowed them to consolidate their gains, to push back the remaining Seleucid garrisons, and ultimately to regain control of Jerusalem, the heart of their spiritual world. With Jerusalem back in their hands, the immediate priority was the temple. It lay desecrated, defiled by pagan altars and idols, its sacred vessels stolen or broken. The task of cleansing and rededicating it was monumental. The people worked tirelessly, driven by a deep sense of purpose. They removed the pagan symbols, purified the altar, and painstakingly repaired what could be repaired. The air, once thick with the stench of sacrifice to foreign gods, was now filled with the determined sounds of restoration. The climax of this effort was the rededication ceremony. According to tradition, They needed pure olive oil to light the menorah, the seven-branched candelabrum, which was meant to burn continuously. They searched the temple and found only one small cruse of oil, enough for a single day. Facing the prospect of the menorah going dark, they lit it anyway, trusting in providence. And then a miracle unfolded. That small cruse of oil, meant to last for just one day, burned for 8 days, giving them enough time to prepare new, pure oil. This miraculous event, the enduring flame, became the central symbol of Hanukkah. The story concludes with a reflection on this incredible journey of resistance and faith. Hanukkah isn't just about military victory. It's about the resilience of the human spirit in the face of oppression. It's a celebration of religious freedom, a testament to the enduring power of belief, and a vivid reminder that even in the darkest times, a small light can triumph over overwhelming darkness. The dedication of the temple, the burning of the oil, these acts cemented a legacy that has lasted for millennia. It's a story that speaks to anyone who has ever fought for their identity, their beliefs, or their right to simply be themselves. Hanukkah reminds us that sometimes the greatest miracles are found not in grand displays of power, but in the quiet, persistent burning of hope when all seems lost.